another few minutes because I see some people coming in, and then we'll start. So I'll give them another 5 minutes or so. Thank you. I think I'll start. Yeah, okay. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for coming tonight. During this time of Lent, we're going to talk about the Shroud of Turin and unveiling the truth about the passion of Jesus and exactly what he went through that's left on this image. How many people here are familiar with the Shroud of Turin? Okay, great, so quite a few people. So basically, the Shroud of Turin The Shroud of Turin is a burial cloth that is 14 feet long and almost 4.5 feet wide. And on the image, on the shroud, bears an image of a crucified male, front and back. It's a studied relic. It's one of the most studied relics that we have that belongs to Jesus. In 1978, Stirp, the Shroud of Turin research project, was invited to the Vatican to study the shroud. For the first time, an extensive study was done. Let me give you a little bit of my background and why I'm here. My name is Jim, and my last name is Nolte, and I'm connected to this 1978 study at the Vatican. Ever since I was a child, I was intrigued by the Shroud of Turin. And when I first saw it, I was about 6 years old, and it was a National Geographic program. And when I watched the shroud, I thought to myself, I really want to know more about this. What is this cloth that bears this face of Jesus? So as I got older, I read as many books as I possibly could on the shroud. I used to go to the Franciscan monastery in Washington, D.C. How many people are familiar with the Franciscan monastery? I used to go there once a month for confession, and I would browse through the bookstore or the gift shop. And there was a brother there that I got to know pretty well. And I had mentioned a book that they sold on the shroud. And he says to me, he says, you know what? He said, you've got to meet Brother Joe, Brother Joseph Pounds. He was at Stirp in 1978 and studied the Shroud of Turin. He actually held it. Him and 4 other religious people from the United States were invited to go and study the shroud. So I thought, I've got to meet this man. Number one, I need to shake his hand because maybe I'll become a relic if he actually touched the shroud. So when I first met him, I was blown away by his knowledge, an encyclopedia set when it came to the Shroud of Turin. What I found out was that he had actually studied under Monsignor Ricci at the Vatican. Monsignor Ricci had studied the shroud since the 1930s. He had written several books. So as I got to know Brother Joe, my parents would take me. God rest my father's soul. He's looking down now and he's saying, good job. It wasn't in vain. But they would take me to the monastery, and I would spend an hour, 2 hours in Brother Joe's room learning as much as I could about this cloth. Before Brother Joe died, he said to me, he said, you know, Jim, He said, I don't have any family. He said, so I want to leave you with all of my Shroud books. So I had a big box of books. It took both of us to carry it out to the car. Now picture Brother Joe, who's up in age, on one end and going blind from diabetes. So most of it was me carrying the big box of Shroud books. But they went back all the way to the 1920s. And one thing that he gave me, and I brought it here today, he said to me, he said, I have something for you that was given to me by the Pope. It was just me and the other religious that had studied the Shroud, and I want to give it to you. It's a thorn from the actual crown of Christ. And I brought it tonight, and it's in a frame. So if anybody wants to touch a medal or a rosary to it, that's what it's here for. So that's how I'm connected to the 1978 study at the Vatican. I want to bring to you, oh, I went in the wrong direction. A little bit of history. What we see here is this beautiful portrait from St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. This picture was painted probably in the year 300 or so. But as you can see, it has a very similar face to the face that's seen on this cloth. Somebody had access to it in the year 300, that they were able to take the image of the face on the cloth and paint this beautiful icon. And we're going to get into all the details about the Shroud later. There's a lot to cover tonight, and we're going to cover it because I want to bring you Jesus crucified. Now, I will let you know that some of these slides are graphic, but so is crucifixion. And I want to bring you the truth of Christ's passion and what he went through for us. That was not Brother Joe calling me. If it was, that's a miracle. So as you can see, this image has a lot of similarities to the Shroud of Turin. This is documented, and it's way before the 1300s. Way before anybody said, this is the time period that the Shroud came from. What we also see is evidence in art. This is the Justinian coin. This Justinian coin was minted in 692 to 695. Again, it's very similar to the face on the Shroud, meaning somebody had access to this long before medieval times. What is interesting about this cloth is that when they look at the pattern, they see that it's a herringbone weave, meaning 3-in-1. It was woven on a loom in a herringbone pattern. Well, what does this exactly mean? Archaeologists have found other pieces of material from Israel, near the Dead Sea Scrolls, near the caves where they found them. And it was the same pattern, a herringbone weave, meaning that it was very typical in first century Judaism to have this type of a weave on a loom. So this cloth is a Jewish cloth. And it's very expensive because only the wealthy could have this particular pattern of herringbone, where it's this very tight weave. Here's what the Shroud of Turin would look like if you were actually looking at it through the naked eye. On the image, we see the back of a man and we see the front of a man. And we're going to cover all of this in a little bit. But I have a lot of people ask, well, what are these? What are these marks? There's water stains. Where do they come from? In 1532, the Shroud was in a fire. And the box that it was contained in melted and put holes in the Shroud. When they doused it with water, they left water stains. The Poor Clare nuns took these patches of cloth and repaired the Shroud as best they could. But one thing that looks very interesting is the fact that the man is in between these burn marks and these patches of cloth, which calls to mind in the book of Revelations when John had the vision of the Son of Man And he says, I saw the Son of Man, whose face was shining white, and he was standing in between candlesticks. Kind of looks like the shroud. Here we see the images side by side. When they took this cloth, they laid the body on one end, and the opposite end was folded over the front. And St. John, in his gospel, says that he was bound with cloths according to the custom of the Jews. I have here, and this table is open for everybody at the end of the presentation to please come up, take pictures. I have a replica of how Jesus would have been buried in the shroud. As he was laid on that cloth, and the opposite end was folded over, strips of cloth bound the ankles, around the waist, and around the neck. This was to keep the shroud in place. But we notice that the image of this man bears marks, many, many, many different kinds of marks. And we're going to cover all of this. But what we're going to cover first is the fact that you're looking at a negative. So whoever the man was in the shroud, he left a negative image that was only going to be discovered near the beginning of the 20th century with photography. I seriously doubt a forger would know how to do that. And this man here, Secondo Pia, in 1898, he was commissioned by the Vatican to take photographs of the shroud so that they could continue their studies. This was the first photograph. And Secondo Pia discovered something that we now know today. He got a lot of backlash for his discovery. And what he discovered was, if you take this negative image and you take a photograph of it, you have a positive image of the man on the shroud. The negative becomes positive. And everything that is on the left side is now on the right. What they discovered was at one time they said that this was actually a handsome man with very handsome features. Recent calculations, they have discovered that this man was between 6 foot and 6'1" and 185 pounds. They said that he was well built, accustomed to hard labor, and somebody who did a lot of walking. Well, remember, in the Gospels, Joseph was a carpenter, which means Jesus would have learned the trade of carpenters. A lot of people say, well, isn't that height a little too much for that time period? Archaeologists have found bones of Jewish men from the 1st century, and the average Jewish height was between 5'10" and 5'11". So again, the shroud is consistent with history and science. He was tall, but even for that time period, not exceptionally tall, average, a 6-foot male. What they also discovered was that on the back of the shroud, the man's hair falls in a ponytail. The sides of the hair fall down to the shoulders. In Judaism, this is known as payas, or side locks. So the man of the shroud had side locks, and the back of his hair was in a ponytail. This is consistent with Orthodox Jews, meaning this is an Orthodox Jewish man that was wrapped in the shroud. What they also discovered is that there is a slight stain in the area of the hair, in the back where the ponytail is. Somebody had dressed the hair or anointed it. Let's step back into the Gospels for a minute. Remember that after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he went to the house of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And Mary anointed his hair. And Judas protested, saying, the money that you spent on this ointment, you should have given it to the poor. And Jesus rebuked him. He said, so concerned for the poor are you, Judas? The poor you will always have with you. Me you will not always have. She is preparing me for my burial. Leave her alone. For I tell you, wherever in the world the Gospels are preached, what she has done will be told in her honor. And on the Shroud of Turin, it shows that somebody very recently before death had anointed his hair. Again, consistent with the Gospels and consistent with science. They found the olive oil-based substance just in the region of the hair. Now we see the positive image of the man on the shroud. We can see in detail all the severe wounds that this man had encountered. What exactly are those wounds? Well, one, let's start with the face. Remember, in the Gospels it says the night before he was taken to Pontius Pilate, after he had been arrested, Caiaphas asked him, "Are you the Son of the living God?" "I am. And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with the angels of heaven." And they spit on him, and they began to beat him and buffet him. Buffet means to slap with the palm. They covered his eyes and began to punch him. "Prophecy, who is it that struck you?" The Shroud of Turin shows these wounds in very vivid detail. We can see that the left cheek is swollen. The right cheek is swollen, and the right eye, is swollen shut. There's a large swelling on the forehead, a swelling on the chin, and the nose has been fractured. There's also a puncture wound or a tear in the right eyelid. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But one thing that they also noticed is, again, the long hair, mustache, and beard. But there's an irregularity to the beard. On the left side, you can see the beard is in full. On the right side, that part of the beard had been ripped out. Again, consistent with the book of Isaiah. "My face I did not hide from them, or those that plucked out my beard." So the Shroud of Turin is consistent with someone who went through a severe beating. And it's consistent with the Gospels. This is a realistic image of what the face of Jesus would have looked like if we were to see him. On the Shroud of Turin, this wound is sort of a triangular shape. It's consistent with someone who was hit in the face with a stick. So clearly, this man did not hide his face from those who abused him. Let this image be seared into our heart, so that on Good Friday, we will see perfect atonement. This, ladies and gentlemen, is love in all of its glory and splendor. A once beautiful face beat to prophesize the book of Isaiah. He was a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. We esteemed him not, stricken, but by his stripes we are healed. And the shroud clearly shows this. Now we're going to get to what was known as the scourging. The scourging was something that was done to every prisoner. Typically what happened was the person was stripped of their clothes, and as they carried their cross to the place of execution, they were scourged. Not the case with Jesus. The Gospels tell us that Pilate tried to have him released, so he had him scourged, thinking that this would pull on the heartstrings of the people and they would let him go. What is Roman scourging? Well, Roman scourging, a person was taken to a tall pillar and stripped of their clothes. The man on the shroud is completely naked, meaning that he was scourged naked. His hands were tied above his head, and he was lashed. We know this because there are no scourge marks on the forearms on the man of the shroud. They also fan. They are vertical on the top of the shoulders, horizontal along the back and the midsection, across the buttocks, and then they fan again downward on the legs and the calves, meaning that there were two people standing behind him scourging him. Those on the right are a little higher, meaning that the person on the right was taller than his companion on the left. The Shroud of Turin clearly shows this. Again, something that a medieval forger would not know to do. Roman scourging consisted of what's known as a Roman flagrum. I have a replica here, and again, it'll be on the table for everybody to take a look at. I know it's hard to see it now in the dark, but a Roman flagrum had 2 to 3 strips of leather, and at the end of the leather were pellets of lead, and they were in the shape of a dumbbell. They were attached at the very end. And a couple of inches above this were attached sheep knuckle bone. So the dumbbell-shaped balls of lead, when hitting human flesh, would cause contusions or hematomas under the skin. Each time that he was lashed, those hematomas would burst and they would stream blood. The sheep knuckle bone would leave trails or tails behind the dumbbell-shaped markings. Well, what we see on the shroud is we can clearly see these dumbbell shapes. There's approximately 220 covering the body, front and back. Imagine taken to a public place, stripped of your clothes, and beat. Scientists a couple years ago noticed that the back of the legs, especially the calves, were severely scourged. Whoever was standing behind the man scourging him really decided to punish the man's legs. These wounds that I'm going to pull up next are graphic, but I want them to be graphic because it's showing you the truth that Jesus endured. This is a realistic image of the scourge wounds that covered the front and the back of the man on the shroud. We can see the ponytail of hair. We can see the shoulder blades, and we can see the markings from these dumbbell shapes. And these are the furrows, or the tails, from the sheep knuckle bone. Again, we go back to Isaiah. What did he say? By his stripes, we are healed. One thing that is something that they discovered a few years ago was above the right buttocks, there was tissue. When they examined the tissue, they found that this part of the man's skin had been beat away so much that muscle was exposed. and it's chosen on the Shroud of Turin. We also notice that there are puncture wounds around the man's forehead, drips of blood in the hair. Pathologists have discovered that some of this is blood from veins and some from arteries. How many people here know how much the scalp bleeds, even if it's just a tiny scratch? A lot. People have bled profusely and go to the ER only to find out that they have a tiny little scratch. It doesn't even need stitches. The scalp is very vascular. And we're going to talk about that pain in a minute. Before I go to the crown of thorns, I also want to share something with you about the scourging. What would the effects of that scourging be? It would have caused profuse sweating. His temperature would have been raised. He would have been dizzy. And he would have gone through bouts of nausea. And then the bleeding. Dehydration would start to set in. And only the hand of God kept him from going into shock. But then again, Jesus also said, "No one takes my life away from me. I lay it down myself." This was a man on a mission. You and me, we were the mission. He was mocked as a king. The Gospels, it says they arrayed him in a scarlet cloak and put a crown of thorns on his head. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see in art is a tiny little wreath with rose bush type thorns. The thorn that Brother Joe gave me that came from the crown is a long, massive thorn. I have a replica on the table of a crown of thorns. Again, it's dark, but you can come up and see it. This is a crown that was not a wreath or a circlet. It actually covered the entire head like a cap. The high priest would have worn what was known as a mitre, the same thing that our popes, cardinals, and bishops wear today. So that crown was in mockery of the high priest, and we know that Christ was the high priest. So that crown was like a mitre, a big bush of thorns placed on his head. There's approximately 70 wounds on the man's head, front and back. They also cover the top of the head. Max Frey was a Swedish botanist, and in 1973 he was commissioned by the Shroud of Turin Research Project and the Vatican to look for pollen samples. He found over 20 pollen samples that come only from Jerusalem in the spring. What he also discovered is around the head, especially these wounds, pollen from the acacia tree. The acacia tree grows all through Jerusalem, and it looks like a weeping willow. The branches are long and pliable, and it grows thorns in pairs. One is straight and one is slightly curved. They're white in color, but they grow anywhere from 3 to 5 inches in length. And that's identical to the thorn that Brother Joe gave me, and it's identical to the crown of thorns that I brought here for you to see. I'm going to take you back a little bit to the Old Testament, and I'm going to connect the Shroud, the Gospels, and the Old Testament. And you guys are going to be like, praise God. In the Old Testament, God spoke to Moses, and he said, I want you to build the Ark of the Covenant. And I want you to cover it in gold. And inside of the Ark of the Covenant, you shall contain the 10 Commandments, the manna from heaven, and the rod of Aaron. In Hebrew, the wood from the tree was known as the shittim tree. The shittim tree is the acacia tree. The tree used to make the Ark of the Covenant is the tree that was used to make the crown of thorns. The Ark of the Covenant held the 10 commandments. Christ said, I am the fulfillment of the commandments. It held the manna from heaven, and Jesus said, I am the bread of life and the rod of Aaron. And Jesus said, I am to sit at the right hand of the power of God. Isn't that amazing that 2,000 years before Christ, the tree was used to make the Ark of the Covenant that 2,000 years later would be made to make the crown of thorns for the bread of life? Isn't God something? Yeah, powerful. This is a realistic image of the man with the blood streams that would have come from the crown of thorns. The only difference is we see that the blood is only going in one direction. This confused pathologists because they were like, I've seen a lot of blood flow. Medical doctors, I've seen a lot of wounds and blood zigzags when it flows. It meets obstacles and it goes around the obstacle. But this blood pattern is in one direction. That means somebody wiped the man's face. So the shroud is consistent with church tradition. Again, let this face be seared into our mind and our heart. What is the effect of this crown of thorns? Do we have any dentists out in the audience? Okay. Anybody out here ever had a toothache? Yeah. You want to ram your head into the wall to stop the pain, right? I hate going to the dentist. But it's one of those times when you want to go and have somebody just yank it out to get relief. What happens with a toothache is it affects what's known as the trigeminal nerve. It's a cluster of nerves in the head. This crowning of thorns would irritate the trigeminal nerve. And the pain associated with this would be a searing pain down both sides of the nose, behind the eyes, into all of the teeth, the top of the head, and the back of the head. Now imagine being pushed, pulled, kicked, prodded. And every time your body jolts, this trigeminal nerve is like being hit with a hot poker. This was that crown, the crown of the king. What we see here are the puncture wounds. And we also see what's called reflex contraction. Anybody know what reflex contraction is? It's what happens when a person is wrinkling their face from pain or suffering. And with wrinkling the forehead, the drops of blood coagulated into a very curious number 3. God's sign, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. 3 people were crucified on Good Friday. The sign above his head was in 3 languages. There were 3 disciples that he was the closest to. 3 people were standing on Mount Tabor during the Transfiguration. And he resurrected from the dead 3 days later. And the Shroud of Turin has a number 3 for everyone to see. They think that that's from reflex contraction because of the suffering and the wrinkling of the forehead that the blood coagulated and left God's sign. Let's now get into some Roman crucifixions, what they were and what they were not. And this is going to help you understand the suffering that this man endured when we get to the carrying of the cross and the crucifixion. Roman crucifixions were not these tall, lofty crosses that we see in art or movies. And it wasn't the plus sign like we see here in church or picture books. Roman crosses were rather low to the ground. A tall man could touch the top of it. It was probably about 7 feet, meaning that when Jesus was nailed to the cross, his feet were probably maybe 2.5 to 3 feet off of the ground. So it was rather low. And it makes sense. When you're crucifying several people a day, as great engineers, you need something that you can assemble and disassemble quickly. The upright, or the stipes, was always left permanently in the ground at the place of execution, meaning they were used over and over and over again. Outside of Israel, Roman crucifixion victims would be left to die on the cross and their bodies would rot. The soldiers would come and knock the bones off, and wherever the bones scattered, that was their burial. But in Israel, they were sensitive to the Jews, so when a person died, they would remove them from the cross, but nonetheless, these crosses were used over and over and over again, meaning they had other people's blood and body fluids. They were weather-beaten. They were not smooth-shaved wood like we see in art. And what they would have done was they would have carried a cross beam to the place of execution, laid on the ground, their hands nailed, and they would have been hoisted up, a soldier on either end of the beam, lifting the person to the top of the stipes, forming a perfect capital T. That was a Roman crucifixion cross. So that's called a tau. Our Lord was crucified on a tau. And they've been discovered in Roman catacombs in the 1st and 2nd century, painted on the walls where the bones of early Christians have been kept. St. Francis of Assisi had a vision of Christ crucified on a tau cross, which is why it became his symbol for the Franciscans. If we go back to the Old Testament real quick, when God was punishing Egypt, he said to the Jews for Passover, "With lamb's blood mark your doorpost, and the angel of death shall pass over you, for I shall know you belong to me." I have a friend who's a Jew for Jesus, and he explained to me that in the original Hebrew, the word is mark your doorpost with a tau, a capital T. And again, 2,000 years later, the lamb at Passover was crucified on a capital T. You can see here the upright beam left permanently in the ground. The cross beam, or the patibulum as they would have carried it, would have formed a perfect capital T. Every prisoner carried a cross beam, and every prisoner had a sign placed above their head. I have a replica of the one that was placed above the head of Christ. It's copied from the relic in Santa Croce. They did some investigating, and they found that it was a walnut board about 2 feet long, and it was painted with white gypsum, and the letters were written in red from right to left, because that's the way the Jews read. And it was Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, just like in the Gospel of John. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This would have been placed above his head. Why do the Jews protest so much? Because if you read Hebrew, every other word that they know how to read says Yahweh or God. So in Hebrew, this says God, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That's why they kept saying, take it down, it's a blasphemy, because they knew what that meant. The relic that we have today has rotted away, and the only thing that's left is the word king. The prisoners would have had that carried around their neck. And when they were nailed to their cross, and every prisoner crucified under Roman rule, you were not tied, you were nailed. That sign was left around their neck. As a final mockery, Pilate had Christ put on the cross above his head, showing To this day, we know it as, that's the King of the Jews. We know that Jesus was not supposed to be crucified that day. He took the place of Barabbas. So no new crosses were made for him. He used the same old weather-beaten wood that somebody else would have carried. And I'm going to demonstrate for you how Jesus would have carried that cross, and the wounds that would have been inflicted that also show up on the Shroud of Turin. Every prisoner carried the crossbeam. They were led naked and scourged on the way to execution. This is a replica of a Roman crossbeam. On the bottom, you'll see, let me turn it this way. On the bottom, you'll see a hole. This is a mortise hole that would sit on a tenon on the upright beam. If I could get two gentlemen or two strong ladies, it doesn't matter, whoever can hold this in for me. Can we put a light on real quick? I'll do some explaining while you get the lights. So this crossbeam is about 6 feet. This is about the length of the crossbeam that Christ would have carried. The only difference is his probably would have weighed about 75 pounds. There's no way I can tote a 75-pound beam, so this is a light replica. You notice the mortise hole. So the prisoner would be placed on the ground and nailed, and then two soldiers with the person attached on either end would lift it and then set it on this upright beam. And the person would be left nailed to a capital T. But how did he carry it? He didn't carry the entire cross, because the entire cross would have been about 200 pounds. A strong man wouldn't have been able to drag it, let alone a man who is dehydrated, bleeding, and sweating profusely. Can we turn it this way? Oh, you know what? Let me do this first. Okay. The beam would have been tied across the back. One end of the beam would be tied to the left ankle. This end of the beam would be tied to the prisoner in front. So they would be like handcuffs. That way the prisoners couldn't swing these beams against the soldiers. The three prisoners were tied together, and each one was tied by the ankle to their beam. In a bent-over position, it was diagonal, high on the right on the man of the shroud and lower on the left. He would have carried the beam this way. And as he was being pulled and pushed, that leg would come out, and he would come down knee first, second knee, and then flat on his face. He had no way to brace himself, so this would have accounted for that swollen forehead and fractured nose. Let this be our symbol for Good Friday, the way that Christ actually carried his cross and the abuse that he went through.
This is also where he would have gotten.
And we're going to get into the wounds in just a minute. Thank you, gentlemen. You guys didn't know that you were coming here to work tonight. And again, this stuff on the table, please, do not ask me if you can take pictures. Absolutely, yes, take pictures. I want people to take pictures. I want people to remember this. So come up after the presentation.
Is this okay with the light level? So you can see everything in front?
How about the folks in the back? Is this okay? Is good? Okay. Actually, you know what? Can we douse the light? Yeah. I just think it'll come in clearer if it's darker. So this is how Franco Zeffirelli, when he made the movie Jesus of Nazareth, had the actor carry the cross. He was a historian, Franco Zeffirelli. So he actually studied Roman crucifixions. And he got it pretty accurate, with the exception of a few things. Monsignor Ricci did a drawing of how Christ carried his cross to the place of execution. We can see the two prisoners in the front. We can see Jesus in the back, and everybody is tied beam to beam and then beam to ankle. You are not going to escape. And the person in the back is going to get the worst of the falls. Because remember, these two in the front are being scourged. So they're writhing in pain as they're walking to the place of execution. And the person who's already weak and suffering is getting the worst of that deal. This is the back of the shroud man. And we can see that inside this blue circle it says chafing by a rough, heavy object. The skin was chafed and there was excoriations of the skin by something that was heavy and rough. They've even in some areas found splinters in the shroud from the shoulder region, meaning that this beam was, again, like I said, high on the right, low on the left, and as he would fall, being that it was loosely tied, not only would it shift, but it would also slide and scrape down the back and the side. They couldn't figure out, well, how come the wounds, the scourging wounds, weren't completely wiped away? Because if we remember in the Gospels, it said they took the cloak off of him and put his own clothes back on. So Jesus' robe was a buffer, which still left these scourge wounds intact, but also left us the way that he actually carried the cross. One thing that I want to point out that was just discovered about 10, 15 years ago was that the right arm of the man on the shroud is a little longer or a little lower than the left. When the doctors and the pathologists and the crime scene investigators and all the people that got involved looked at it, they found out that the man had a dislocated shoulder, the result of a fall. It would have separated the teres major and minor, the rhomboids along the spine, the clavicle, and the neck. We know that Simon of Cyrene had to help carry the cross because when Jesus fell and his shoulder is dislocated, and again, remember this when we're looking at the Stations of the Cross on Good Friday, our Lord walking like this to execution with a dislocated shoulder. They also discovered on the right side of the face that the right eye droops and the right side of the mouth droops, that the man had facial paralysis, which is very common for somebody that has a dislocated shoulder and it's pulling the neck muscles, an incredible pain, which would cause paralysis of the face. Let's remember this on the first, second, and third falls during Stations of the Cross. How many people here have heard of the tunic of Argenteuil? The tunic of Argenteuil goes all the way back to about 700 AD. It's the seamless robe of Jesus. It's in church documents that the Pope had it and passed it on, and it now has ended up in Argenteuil. What they found was that this robe fit a man who was about 6 foot. They took and discovered that now the pieces that are left of it, when they put it together, they superimposed it over the shroud because they found stains that they discovered was human blood, AB positive, the same as the blood type on the Shroud of Turin. And when they superimposed this tunic over the shroud, they found where all the spots were that the crossbeams slid around and chafed the body and stained the robe with, as they described, copious amounts of blood. I have a replica, and everybody can come up and look at it, of the tunic of Argenteuil, as Jesus would have worn it before death. So this is the robe that was gambled for and cast lots. They also discovered that the robe had what was known as dyer's matter. It was a plant-based dye that they still use to this day in Israel when they dye wool. And they described the tunic as being made of wool, and it was sort of like the color of faded wine or like a brick red. And today, modern day Israel, we can see the same wool in dyer's matter, which is identical to this first century robe of Jesus. And the shroud shows that he wore something to protect his already lacerated back. We see that there's dirt evidence on the knees, dirt evidence on the tip of the nose, the chin, the forehead. What they uncovered was that that's travertine aragonite. It's a big word, right? But guess what? Travertine aragonite is the components of dirt from Jerusalem. It's got like limestone, meaning that this shroud was in Jerusalem, and this man fell in Jerusalem. The dirt is embedded in the knees, the bottoms of the feet, the forehead, the tip of the nose, and the chin. Now, I ask you, what medieval forger would go to Israel, scoop up some dirt, put it on the shroud, and say, ha, they're going to find this in the 20th century when they have the technology to do it? No, this is only the hand of God. Jesus is nailed to the cross. Finally, he gets to his mission, to sit on his throne. They would have placed him on the ground, they would have nailed him, and then they would have hoisted him and the crossbeam to the upright, forming that perfect capital T. And all four Gospels are consistent that they led him out to a place called Golgotha, and there they crucified him. We see evidence of something that was done to the wrists and the feet. We see it in the red circle. Dr. Pierre Barbet in the 1930s used to take cadavers. He was a French surgeon, and he was completely blown away with the shroud. He would take cadavers and he would crucify them to see what the effect would be on the body. And what he did was he would nail them through the palms of the hands, and he would watch them fall off of the cross because their body weight was too much for the palms to hold. So he would take the nail and he would drive it into the wrist area known as Descartes space, 4 bones that make a circle. Now the person can hang. We see on the shroud that the wound is in the wrist area, medically consistent with what would be known as Descartes space. We also notice that the man of the shroud has no thumbs. Dr. Pierre Barbet found out that when you nail a person through the wrist, it severs or partially severs the median nerve, which causes the thumb to permanently be flexed into the palm of the hand, and the fingers to curl into a claw-like position, meaning his hands were paralyzed in this position for the remainder of his life. Any sciatica sufferers? Okay. That's the sciatic nerve. When he was nailed through the wrist, it was severed or partially severed the median nerve. That would have been like sciatic pain in both arms. A driving, burning pain from the wrist, up the arm, into the shoulders, and into the chest. In Gavit Matar, Israel, in 1968, they actually excavated a real crucified victim. And they found that he was nailed through the feet, but he was also nailed through the wrists. They saw the bones that still contained the fragment of nail. So the shroud is consistent with science and history. A lot of people say, well, what about when Jesus appeared and he says, oh, look at my hands and my feet. Come, Thomas, put your finger into the holes in my hand. We have to remember Jesus didn't speak English. He spoke Aramaic. And there's no word for wrist or arm in Aramaic. So hand does not discount the shroud. Again, we see that it is consistent. When Jesus said, if your right eye is an occasion of sin, pluck it out, did he literally mean pull your eye out? Of course not. We're not sola scriptura. We're the true church, and we know that there's tradition, and we know that we need people to interpret the Bible for us. So again, it doesn't invalidate anything. It strengthens the cause for the Shroud of Turin because it's medically accurate. This next image is graphic. This is the image of the man's hands crossed in the shroud. And we can see the hole in the wrist at death dot space, but we also see this irregular blood pattern on the forearm. Roman crucifixions, when you were suspended from your arms, and Dr. Frank Zugibe in the 1980s crucified his patients, they were alive. They volunteered to do it. What he found out was, while suspended, in approximately 12 minutes, he had them hooked up to EKG machines and he checked their respiration. Their CO2 levels dropped, but their heart rate skyrocketed. They had to change positions. Then their heart rate dropped and their respiratory system leveled. Again, after 12 minutes, they had to drop back down and they went through this cycle. In an hour, he had to take them off the cross because their heart rates were all over the place and their CO2 levels were all over the place. Nobody took Jesus down. For 3 hours, he struggled to breathe. We know that he had to push up on his nailed feet, pulling on these median nerves and this dislocated shoulder just to breathe. The muscle spasms in his chest and his arms would cause him to drop. Then the muscle spasms in his thighs and his calves, he would have to pull up again quickly. I want you to picture this suffering. For 3 hours, pulling on these nerves and this dislocated shoulder. We know that he had 7 beautiful sayings from the cross, each one for us. Now imagine the struggle that he had to go through just to say those words. And what was the first thing he thought to say? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And he would drop. And a little while later, he would have to pull up to breathe and drop. And then pull up, woman, behold your son. John, behold your mother, and drop. I thirst, and drop for 3 hours. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And drop. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It is finished. One thing that they noticed on the shroud was because of this dislocated shoulder, the elbow is severely bent, meaning that he was in a twisted position when he died. Picture this on Good Friday. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It is finished. And this is the position that he died in. His knees in one direction, his hips in another, and his arm twisted. This is the image of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. This wretched figure, our God. So remember that bent and twisted position in death was perfect atonement for us. This is a realistic image of how the nail would have been placed in the hand and the amount of blood that would have flowed. We see that this amount of blood flow is consistent with modern-day stigmata, Padre Pio. We see pictures of Padre Pio and his hands are covered in blood. And we can see realistically that this is our Lord. The next image, again, is the crossed hands. We can see the hole in the wrist. We also know that his feet were nailed. We know this because on the shroud, if you were to actually look at the shroud and then look at the photographic image of the shroud, the positive, we can see that the left foot was nailed over the right. And both feet were pointed and flat against the upright beam. There was no footrest like we see in some pictures. That wasn't invented until the 2nd or 3rd century. So the feet were nailed flat, which would have strained the calves, the ankles, and the knees. And when he died, rigor mortis had set in, and the shroud shows the position that the feet were still in. We can see the bottom of the right and the partial bottom of the left. And we can see it far more clear, and we can see the hole where the nail was placed. It would have gone through the plantar nerve, again, sending a burning sensation up both legs. We can see the placement of the nail. We can see that the feet are severely pointed and flat against the upright. If we were to look at the Shroud of Turin in rigor mortis, we would see the cut knees from the fall. We would see the left is still partially over the right. The knees are flexed, and we can see the bottom of the feet, and we can see the hole in the sole of the foot. Let me also point out that if anybody wants pictures of these slides after the presentation, I can pull them back up if you want to take pictures of them, which I think is a great idea because it just keeps us focused on this man's passion. This is a realistic image of Jesus crucified. It's the same one that I have here on the table. It has every single detail humanly possible, with the exception of one thing, the loincloth. Our Lord would have been crucified naked. In Judaism, it's believed that the blood is life, and there's life in the blood. So anybody who goes through a traumatic death and bleeds on any article of clothing, they have to be buried with that clothing. We know that Jesus was buried nude, meaning he died nude. His clothes were taken from him. We know that in the Gospels, it says that they went and broke the legs of the first thief and the second thief. This was to keep them from pulling up. Now they suffocate and they die. But when they got to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. So one with a lance pierced him in the side, and immediately came out blood and water. We can see the piercing. We can see it's sort of an oval shape. It's between the 5th and 6th rib on the right side. And we can see that the blood is trickling. This means it's post-mortem. If he was alive, the blood would spurt. But since he's already dead, it just dribbles. And in these red circles, we see fluid. John called it water. Today, we know exactly what it is. Pulmonary fluid. A man who was beat about the chest, fell with a rough object falling on him, caused fluid to back up in his lungs. There's a sac around the heart, and it flowed also into this sac. So when it was pierced, it pierced the lung, it pierced that sac, the pericardium sac, and it pierced the heart. And immediately, blood and water came out. And the shroud shows it, and it's consistent with the gospel. This is a realistic image of what that side wound would have looked like. We can see the horrible scourging, the dumbbell shape, the tails, and in the middle we can see this wound that pierced the heart of our Lord. You know, Eucharistic miracles, there was one in Argentina a few years ago before Pope Francis became Pope. Somebody had dropped the Eucharist and the priest put it in water. The next day it began to bleed. So he went and he got then the bishop, who is none other than future Pope Francis. He had a medical team investigate it, and they found out that the blood was AB positive, but the host had turned into heart tissue from a dying man. It was heart tissue that was in the midst of a heart attack. We know that Christ cried out with a loud voice before he expired. So my question is, what ruptured his heart? What broke his heart? Was it the trauma? Was it the lance? Or was it our sins? I think it was all three, and the shroud shows it. This is another image of what the man would have looked like buried in the shroud. We can see again the dumbbells shape, the scourges. We can see this side wound. We also curiously see this blood pattern along the kidney area in the back. This is from the side wound, and what they believe is that it was caused when they took him to the tomb. Remember, the Jews were celebrating a dual holiday, Sabbath and Passover. So they didn't want to be unclean by touching a dead body. So what they did was they would have rocked the patibulum back and forth, taken it down with him still attached after they drew the nail out of the feet. Somebody would have taken a cloth, wrapped it around the ankles, two people on either end of the crossbeam, and one person with a folded cloth around the waist, holding it up as they walked him to the sepulcher. He was in two positions, vertical and then horizontal. This blood, which ran from the side wound, we can see where that cloth was placed around the waist to carry him to the tomb. And it wasn't a long walk, because remember, here he was crucified, Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was there. This is an image from Monsignor Ricci, how Jesus would have been removed from the cross. Very different than what we see in art. This is how he would have been carried. They would have had a cloth around the ankles, two people on either end, and then a cloth in the middle, and they would have carried him to his place of burial. What we have here is a beautiful painting of how Jesus was actually placed in the shroud. He was put on one end, and the other end was folded over, which is why we have this back-to-back image, front to back. This is the final wrapping of how he would have been placed in the shroud, how it would have been tied, according to the Gospel of John, with the bands of cloth, and laid in the sepulchre. So the pathology, a body in repose of death. We know that there's rigor mortis. We see it, it's evident on the shroud. We see that the head is still tilted forward in death. We see that the thorax is hyperextended, meaning that when he was buried, his chest was raised and his stomach was sunk in, which is very typical of somebody who's gasping for air at the end of life. We see that the legs are bent, the knees are bent, and we can see that the left foot is still flexed partially over the right. Again, it is consistent with science. This is a realistic image of how the man would have been buried in the Shroud of Turin. Now we're going to get to another cloth, a cloth that's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. It's kept in Spain. It's a face cloth. And on the cloth, they found blood stains and pulmonary fluid. It's 40% blood, 60% pulmonary fluid. It was used to cover the face of the dead. Out of sensitivity for people standing around, it was placed over his face while he remained on the cross after death for them to secure from Pontius Pilate that they could remove the body. There are 3 sets of blood stains and pulmonary fluid, all of which ran out of his nose and his mouth. Pathologists and crime scene investigators have looked at this, and the first set of stains, they said that the man was still on the cross 45 minutes to an hour after death, and his face was covered. The second set of stains was when they rocked that patibulum back and forth, removing him from the cross. The other stains came out again from his nose and his mouth. That was the second set. The third set was when he was in that horizontal position being carried to the sepulcher. And what we see here is the sudarium, as it would have covered his face in death, and the blood from the pulmonary fluid and the blood from the nose and the mouth staining it. We can see that there are 3 different stains from 3 different positions. This is a model on the bottom of the face as we would have seen his face covered in blood. That sudarium, when they got to the tomb, they would have taken it off of his face and they would have wrapped it. What I have here is a replica of the sudarium. And what they would have done is they would have folded it, placed it under the chin, and tied it on the top of the head. This was to keep the mouth closed. On the Shroud of Turin, we see that the face is rather square, and there's 2 dark images on either side of the cheeks. That is the chin band used to keep the mouth closed. This is consistent with Jewish burial. When Jesus left the shroud on Easter morning, in the Gospels it says Peter and John ran to the tomb. John got there first. He was probably younger, faster. When Peter got there, they went in, and they saw the grave cloths lying there, but that which was about the head folded up in a place by itself. And they believed. Why? Why did the gospel writer feel the need to put that in there for us? Well, one, my belief is they saw the shroud and the image. But there's also another reason. And again, my friend, the Jews for Jesus friend, who explains a lot of the Judaism aspects of the gospel to me, said this sudarium, when Jesus got out of the shroud, he himself took that sudarium off and folded it and put it in a place by itself. Jim, do you know what that means? I said, no. What's it mean? He said, when a master was done at the table, he would take his napkin and he would place it on the plate. The servant would come out and see it and know that he was done, clear the plate. But if that master took that napkin and folded it a certain way and put it to the side, the servant would look at this and it would mean, I'm coming back. So when Jesus himself got out of that shroud and took that siderium off, he folded it in a place by itself, telling Peter, I'm coming back. And they believed. Isn't God something? We've discovered quite a few years ago that the Shroud of Turin actually has 3D properties, meaning whoever was in this shroud not only left a perfect image of himself, but he also left a 3D image to which we could build a model of what the man looked like. They did a VP8 image analyzer, and they found out, the U.S. Air Force, that there were 3D properties. Who would have thought to put on a piece of cloth a 3D image of a corpse? God, that's who. There's a 3D image of the face on the man of the shroud. I'm going to let him get a picture before I move it, if you guys are wondering why I got quiet. This is an image of Pope Pius. We tried to do the same thing to Pope Pius's photo that's on the Shroud of Turin. One, we tried to make it a negative, and then two, we tried to add 3D properties to it, and guess what? We failed miserably. Because there's only one who could do that, and he did it. I don't get too much into this kind of stuff. I keep it more the medical part and more of the actual passion of Jesus. And I'm going to make a comment here in the end of the presentation as to why I don't and who does. But we'll get to that in a minute. So again, let's cover. We know that the image was formed after the blood because there's blood stains on the other side of the shroud. But the image is only on the surface the width of a human hair. There's no pigment dye or added material. The image does not penetrate the fibers. It doesn't go all the way through to the other side like blood. It's proportional to the body, from body distance to the linen. It doesn't burn, and it's called rapid oxidation. Who here knows what rapid oxidation is? Me either. Until I studied it a little bit further. And I found out that we all have rapid oxidation if we have carpet. You go home and you move the furniture and the carpet's darker and fresher underneath compared to what's outside where people have been walking or the sun has been on it. That's rapid oxidation. And that's what the image is on the Shroud of Turin. A few years ago, they did some investigating, and like I said, they found that the top fibers, the width of a human hair, it took approximately 3 minutes for a burst of energy, 34 trillion watts, in 3 minutes to oxidize a reversed 3D image on the cloth. 34 trillion watts of energy. Man, he wasn't kidding when he said, I am the light of the world. He said it and he meant it. And he put it right there for us to see it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the moment of the resurrection. When that image on the shroud was left. 34 trillion watts of energy right there. And the man passed through the shroud and took off himself that siderium and folded it so that the two disciples would believe, and then later down through the centuries, we would believe. The next thing I want to cover is the veil of Menopello. How many people know what the veil of Menopello is? So the veil of Manipello is kept in Abruzzo, Italy, in the church Manipello. It's a face cloth that was placed on the outside of the Shroud of Turin. All the Jews to this day still bury their dead in a shroud, and on the outside of it they put a napkin or a face cloth. So this was outside. This is the moment of resurrection. When Jesus left his image on the shroud of a corpse, he left the image of a face on the veil of Manipello as he was resurrecting. We can see that the wounds are beginning to heal. The face is irregular and flat because it does not have 3D properties like the shroud. But what they discovered is that this cloth, and Pope Benedict XVI in 2006 went and prayed in front of this cloth and said, "I have just seen the Lamb of God." This cloth is known as byssus silk. It's marine byssus, meaning that it was made from a snail in the Mediterranean. It is so thin that you can read a newspaper through it. It's as thin as a woman's nylon. And what they found out is there's no dye, there's no paint, there's no pigment. It has the same qualities as the cloak of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It's iridescent, and it shimmers like peacock feathers on something as thin as a nylon. They discovered that the wounds are healing, and they see that the man has side locks, beard, mustache. He has dark hair. Go figure, right? He's Jewish. They took this and superimposed it over the Shroud of Turin. And now, lo and behold, it matches. Now it's starting to get a 3D property. The divine mercy, gift from God. St. Faustina had this painted in 1931. She cried about it. She said, "Who's going to paint you as beautiful as you are?" Jesus appeared to her and he said, "You're right, it's not that good. But it's not in the colors, and it's not in the brushstroke, but in the graces." They took the divine mercy image and by accident discovered something. When they superimposed the veil of Manipello over the divine mercy image, it actually began to match. They also came up with another discovery. They took the divine mercy image and superimposed it over the Shroud of Turin, and it matched 100%. They took the full image. St. Faustina had a full image of Jesus painted, and the actual image shows a man that's about 6 foot. They superimposed it over the shroud, and they found that the face, the nose, the beard, the hair match identical. Shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, and where Jesus is walking forward in the divine mercy with his left foot, it matches the left foot of the Shroud of Turin. Where he's pulling the cloth, or his robe, revealing his heart, it actually matches where the heart on the man of the shroud would be. And the red ray actually crosses over the side wound. They found that by accident. Jesus left us 2,000 years ago his image on the cloth, the Shroud of Turin. A dead image. 2,000 years later, he left us a resurrected image. Excuse me. Time for a drink. They took all three of these. And how many people are familiar with AI, artificial intelligence? Okay, well, I just discovered it a little while ago. I'm way behind time. which obviously guys could tell I needed somebody to help me with the computer. So AI took the veil of Manipello and they gave it 3D properties. And they took the distortion out of the face. They took the divine mercy and they took the Shroud of Turin. They took out all the wounds on the shroud and they put all three together. And guess what they came up with? The image of Jesus of Nazareth. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the shroud, the divine mercy, and the veil of Manipello all superimposed together. Saint Faustina was right. Nobody could paint him as beautiful as he is. And I'll put this back up if people want to take a picture of this, of the Holy Face. And again, like I said, if there's other slides, I can put them up. You know, in Matthew, Jesus took the disciples to the side and he said to them, "Who do you say that I am?" Well, some of them probably sat there thinking, "God, I hope he doesn't call on me because I don't really know." Others said, "One of the prophets." Another one said, "John the Baptist." Simon said, "You are the Son of the living God." And Jesus looked at him and he said, "Simon Bar-Jonah, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Kepha, Aramaic for Peter. Kepha, upon this rock I will build my church. I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Tonight, Jesus is asking you, who do you say that I am? My prayer for all of us is that we will come closer to Jesus on Good Friday, now that we know his suffering, and now that we know the extent of the crucifixion. Let us keep him closer in our hearts and our thoughts on Good Friday. And let's also keep Mama Mary, whose sword shall pierce your heart as well, and it did. So let's remember them on Good Friday. I offer up tonight's session to the poor souls in purgatory. I thank you for being so gracious here at St. Raphael, and may God bless you all. Thank you and good night. Thank you. Now I'd like to open it up if anybody has any questions. I'll try to answer questions as much as I can or as best as I can. And then after that, if people want to come up and take pictures of the stuff on the tables, if anybody wants pictures of slides, please feel free, let me know. I also want to thank my very good friend Joe, who's in the audience tonight, who lent me his truck to haul all of this stuff here. It's been amazing. And I would also like to thank Mr. Alan Rabel, who's in the back. His father, Dr. Rabel, studied the Shroud since 1978. And his dad was a huge inspiration for me in studying the Shroud. His father and my father both passed away in 2019, kind of close to the same time. Mr. Rabel does presentations on the Shroud. He will be presenting with me tomorrow night at St. John Newman. He is fantastic on the history part. Remember earlier I said I don't get too much into the history or the research. That's Alan's job, and Alan is fantastic at it. So if you want to hear the history of the Shroud and you want to know about the experiments and the things that they've done, join us tomorrow at St. John Newman in Gaithersburg. Alan, you want to just stand up and let everybody see you real quick? I know I put you on the spot. Alan is fantastic at that kind of stuff. He answers questions. He knows what he's talking about. And his inspiration came from his dad, God rest his soul. He was a medical doctor, and he traveled around giving presentations on the Shroud like we do. And I have some of his books. I studied him, and Dr. Rabel was a huge inspiration. So Brother Joe, Monsignor Ricci, and Dr. Rabel. They were the ones that put me here tonight. So thanks to your dad, Alan. Thanks to you. Thank you, Joe, for your truck. And thank you all. So now it's open for questions. Yes, sir.
Jim, could you speak to the infliction, the serum on the shroud?
Yes, that's a good point. What they discovered around some of those dumbbell markings was a serum, which is consistent with somebody who was suffering from an infection. So somewhere along the lines, the man of the shroud had picked up an infection from the wounds. Again, we have to remember that these scourges were also used over and over and over again. So they would have had other people's body fluids and blood and all kinds of nasty stuff. So he probably would have gotten an infection along the line somewhere from some type of instrument used against him. And again, the shroud clearly shows that, which is consistent with science. Yes, ma'am. That's just a fold. Yeah. Yeah. And again, tomorrow night, for the history folks, Alan is really good at talking about the mandilion and how the shroud was folded throughout history in so many different centuries, and it left these permanent creases. The mandilion was known as the face. But they didn't realize that when you actually unravel the whole thing, you've got a full-length image of a man. So they just had the image of the face. And that's what these are just creases where the shroud was folded like 12 different ways. Yes. The shroud is beginning to show that the image is fading, which is why the Vatican no longer shows it. At St. John's in Turin, they used to keep it in a glass enclosure above the altar. It's now in an airtight sealed casket, and there's no more investigating to be done on it because they're afraid now that being that it is so old and the image is fading, that you either believe it or you don't believe it now. So the Vatican has stopped all investigations with it. Yeah, yes, ma'am. I think you had your. Thank you. Thank you. For those of you that couldn't hear, her comment was she really enjoyed the way tonight it was presented in tying in the Old Testament with the shroud and the New Testament and going back to Judaism and how everything was pointing towards the coming of the Messiah and how the Messiah fulfilled his mission. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
Could you also speak to the bottle with the carbon?
Yes. So again, I don't really get into that too much. I'm going to touch on it very briefly. Again, if you want another good explanation, Alan's the man for that. But the carbon-14 dating, when they cut the cloth, they actually cut the strip of cloth that the Poor Clare nuns had sewn on. So they actually did get a cloth from the 1300s. It just wasn't the shroud that they cut. So that's why it came back as a medieval forgery. And the Vatican has absolutely said there's no more tampering, no more cutting, nothing is going to be done with it anymore. Yes, sir.
What's the first time that somebody identified the shroud? Where has it been for 2,000 years? Who owned it? How did it get?
Alan, you want to take a stab at that one?
Before I answer that, just on the carbon 14, they took that thread as Jimmy just described, and it was in an erroneous part because research shows that over 50% of the carbon 14 dating is erroneous. Now, what they did, they had three proficient scientists, and the scientists went to three different countries and independently had it tested. But they didn't do what That's true. The thing I do want to say about Carbon 14, when my dad was doing his lectures, and he was in pretty much the height of the late 80s, his phone stopped ringing right after that incident. And he would have church after church call him to do his presentation down in North Carolina. We lived growing up in the Bible Belt. So it was a fascinating time. And then I'll add to the Carbon 14, there'll be a slide we'll have tomorrow night. It's called White X-ray dating. And they realized that, as Jimmy explained, and he does a great job with the Jewish custom and all, that the shroud is actually made of cellulose linen. Picture it like spaghetti. And that, basically breaks up over time. That time is measured with X-rays. And they dated that back to 2000. That's been peer-reviewed, and that's rather new research. So we know that there's counter evidence against the poor testing that was done with carbon 14. Now, on to this next question, which was, I forgot. It's good one to explain the carbon 14 because it's huge in the community. What was the last question? Oh, where's it been? So, we have a slide tomorrow night that will show Jesus died in 33 AD. It went in, it's a quick story, but King Akbar of Edessa, which was basically, call it north, west of Jerusalem, asked Jesus to come up and heal him. He was sick. Jesus said, my ministry is not done yet. St. Thaddeus came down, met Peter. Jesus had been crucified, which Jimmy well outlined tonight. The shroud went up to Edessa. It was there for about 944. There was a lot of wars that were going on, and it moved over to Constantinople because of the spoils of war. This is where it gets a little fuzzy. And about the year 1200, the Fourth Crusade, they moved up to France. And there was basically Lorraine, France, and then down to Chambray, France, and then to Turin, Italy in 1578. Did I get that number right, Jimmy?
Yeah, it sounds about right. Yeah.
So, but what happened, there was about a 150-year period. As Jimmy outlined some of the ancient art, we'll talk a little bit about that timeline tomorrow night. It's really important to understand there were two historians, Cabone and Wilson, and they both document a lot of ancient art things, and I kind of get into that at the beginning, and I'm turning the PowerPoint over to Jimmy right after that, because he does a great job. So, okay.
Who took the shroud from place to place?
Well, back in those times, because of the Crusades, they were trying to get it out of harm's way. And my dad described it this way. My dad said there was a custodial provision over this shroud throughout the ages. Now, that's probably his spirit, like you heard Jimmy's spirit quoting the scriptures. I'm not qualified like that. That's their spirit moving them. But there was really, I think, a historic hand of God, but it is documented. Tomorrow night, I'll talk about that documentation of why it got moved from here to there, and it's a pretty it's just a lot of details to the history. I would have to sit down and take a course on it. But there's Cabone and Wilson is a book that you should probably read about to answer your question. I haven't personally written the book. I'll have some books here too. Did you bring some books?
No, I didn't bring any books, but it's a good thing that you brought that up because I have actually, and I need everybody. Yeah, I need everybody to pray for me because I feel like I want to write a book about this. And I've been thinking about it. My wife has told me about a year ago you should do it, and I kind of ignored it. I didn't pay any attention to it because it's my wife. I'm not supposed to listen to her, right? But she was right. And then 3 other people have said to me, do you have a book? I said, no. And they said, you should write a book. So since you brought that up, I wanted to share that with everybody, that I am actually contemplating writing a book. I'm looking for Catholic publishers. So please keep me in your prayers that that will come to fruition and that we will be able to get this message, Jesus crucified, to a whole bunch of people all throughout the year, not just Lent, because he's there every day for every season. So please keep me in your prayers.
Please pray for you. You have so much to offer.
Thank you. Write the book. Okay, everybody keeps saying, write the book. Yes, sir.
Was there any tissue on the shroud that would allow for
No. No. No, it's probably so far gone at this point that they don't have anything like that. Were they able to get any DNA off of the shroud? And I said that I don't think I've heard anything where they've gotten DNA because it's pretty old.
Yeah, so actually Dr. Heller's book, Heller, is fascinating because Jimmy has a slide there, a little old thinking that's like on an item. And it's really the typical year. And you can get documentation. Jimmy shared he was watching something, I think on TV, with the Shroud of Turin. Scourge got to take about 39 scientists over there. Dr. Heller was back, not part of that U.S. Nonprofit organization that went over. We could do a movie just on how those guys got from the U.S. and they had to work in secrets that the media didn't know they were going over. They only trusted National Geographic, not Time, not Life, not Newsweek. They didn't believe in the lies that they would disseminate in the public. So historically, again, National Geographic had rights and they followed them into Scourge being published. Dr. Heller anxiously awaited back at Yale University. He was a non-believer. He was an agnostic, basically. But he believed in the scientific method, and he was intrigued by what was going on behind the scenes. Long story short, he and his labs at Yale tested what was called a picogram, a very small micron, and he was able to fluoresce that, and he had certain tests, and as Jimmy said, it was AB positive.
So yeah, the blood type they were able to pull up, that it was AB positive. Any other questions? I thought I saw some hands somewhere.
What time tomorrow night?
Tomorrow night will be at St. John Newman, 7 p.m. No, I haven't. Again, my wife said you should do a YouTube channel, and I failed again at listening to her. So I will not go home tonight and tell her that all of you are on her side because I'll never live it down. But yes, the thing is I don't know about the videos because I would need somebody that can do like the editing. I don't know how to do any of that, and I don't know anybody that would be able to edit stuff for me. But I think it's a great idea to do something like that.
Jimmy, we'll live stream your death and presentation tomorrow night at St. John Newman.
Perfect.
You go up to St. John Newman, Gaithersburg, go on the website and look for a live stream. You might be able to catch up.
Okay.
My job is just really humbling. I honestly just don't want to mess Jimmy up.
No, he's great. He's great. I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
I'm asking what part of the United States are you from?
Here.
Oh, you're local?
I was born in Washington, D.C., and we now live in Silver Spring. Yeah, so we're local. Yeah. I saw somebody else. Yes, sir.
They removed Jesus' body from the nails of the cross. They have special tools, or they just slide the hands out of these little covers so stretched out.
No, because this is a replica Roman nail. So you can see the head, how big the head is, and it was purposely that big so that a prisoner, couldn't rip that wound. And the shaft is square, so this is about 6 inches. What they would have, probably like pliers, they would have taken the nail out of the feet first, and that's why I'm saying they would take that patibulum down because it's easier to put somebody on the ground and pull nails out than to do it while they're suspended. You have more of a solid base on an upright, so taking the nail out of the feet, it would be much easier to take the person and the beam down, draw it out. But again, because of the holidays, they didn't want to touch the body. So they would have carried him to the sepulcher, and then before going into the tomb, they would have taken those nails, probably discarded the cross beam, maybe carried it back. It wasn't theirs, it was a Roman's. We know that St. Helena found the cross. According to tradition, it was in a hole behind Golgotha. What happened to it from the moment he was removed to 300 years later, Nobody really knows. But my guess is that would probably be the easiest way to take somebody down. Remember, these Romans, they were, perfect at crucifying people. They had done it over and over and over. They were perfect engineers. So they had it down to a fine science. Like anything that we do over and over, we figure out how to work smart and not hard. Any other, yes, sir?
Comment. When you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is a slab, and supposedly they put the prisoners on there to prepare them for burial.
And I'm glad he brought that up because I actually brought a replica of how the body would be prepared in the pre-burial chamber. So you can come up and take a look at this. Thought I saw somebody else. Do we have any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes. So her question is, she hasn't heard of the veil of Manipello. Has it been subjected to the same tests? And the answer is yes. That's how they know that there's no dye, there's no paint, there's no pigment, and it's consistent with the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So it was created on this cloth the same way that the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe was created. And there's no way anybody could paint on it because when they held it up to the light, you can read a newspaper through it. So there's no dyes, there's no paints. It's actually the coloring, and it's in full color, is actually part of the fibers. So if that makes sense, that's only something God could do. Yeah, I see. So the veil of Veronica, that's a really good question. The veil of Veronica is actually kept in the Vatican, and it is so black with age that you can't even see a face. The last time that it was actually shown was around the time of Saint Therese in the 1800s. There's church document that it was on public display for Good Friday then, in like late 1880s, I think, but it hasn't been shown since, and it's just, you can't make out features or anything on it. Oh, I see some hands. I'm going to come back here so I can hear. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Yes, so that's a really good question. Her question was, how did they nail Jesus to the cross? Did they use a hammer? And the answer would be yes. They had a hammer that probably looked like a mallet. Do you know what a mallet is? Yeah. So it probably looked something like that. And they would have, placed it on the skin, and they would have just hammered it in until it was secure in the wood, and they knew that he couldn't get away. But that's a really good question. I've never had anybody ask that question. That was really good. You know what? Good question. I like that. That was really good. That was smart. I like it. Did I see any other hands? Yes, ma'am. That's a really good question. And as a matter of fact, the person who is now the official Shroud photographer, his name is Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz was invited to the Vatican in 1978, and he thought it was a joke because he was Jewish and atheist. And he didn't want to have any part in anything that was Christian or anything that was God. And throughout the years, Barry Schwartz has now opened up a website talking about the Shroud of Turin and how he has come to faith in God and how he believes that the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. So that's a conversion. And I'm sure that there have been quite a few conversions along the lines because I can't imagine having this type of knowledge, a background in criminology or pathology or a medical doctor or a crime scene investigator, and looking at this and not coming away thinking that is Jesus of Nazareth. I can't imagine. You would have to be pretty closed-minded, I would think, to not have the Spirit speak to you in converting. That's just my thinking. At least I know I would. However, I've often wondered, with the 12 apostles. He was there living with them. How hard was it for them to believe? How hard was it for them to understand? I think that when you see somebody raise a dead man after 4 days to life, that's probably a good indication that you should believe this person. And I wanted to bring something up also. One thing that was quite interesting, it hasn't been proven, but all the people that investigated the shroud have had a really hard time finding a belly button. A belly button on the shroud. Now, we know that Adam was created from the dirt. He didn't have a belly button. We also know that Eve was created from his rib. She didn't have a belly button. We know that Jesus is the second Adam. Perhaps he also didn't have a belly button. Somebody said one time, well, last year I was at St. Andrew's, my parish, and I had talked about this, and they were like, I can't wrap my head around this. How can he be in his mother's womb and not have a belly button? I said to him, well, first of all, he walked on water. He raised a dead man to life. He turned water into wine. And you think a belly button's an issue? Not so much. The Son of God. Now, I also will say the writings of St. Bridget of Sweden, the Virgin Mary appeared to her several times, and she had visions of the life of the Blessed Mother. And Mary appeared to her one time, and she said to her, my daughter, she said, do not think that I was like other women. She said, I did not bear my son with labor pain. She said, when we got to the grotto, she said, I prayed, and she said, behold, my son was born from my womb. She said, perfect and beautiful. So we already know that this wasn't a normal birth. And I don't think that even if the man of the shroud does not have a belly button, that certainly does not invalidate his humanity. Because we can clearly see that he was a full human being on this cloth. But we also know that he was fully God. So, as he said to St. Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're thinking as men think, not as God thinks. Right? Because nothing's impossible to him. But I just thought I'd throw that out there, that I thought it was very interesting that all of these people that have checked the shroud over the last couple of years have not been able to find a belly button. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a website with like pictures and explanations and names of the people that you mentioned, and you look up to get books and things like that? I mean, you have so much knowledge, and this is like a gift you gave to me.
Thank you.
As far as what I've heard, and it's greatly affected me there. And
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Yes. So to recap, I need to write a book, I need to do a video, and I need a website. And I need funding. Yes, absolutely. Because I do this because I just want to bring Jesus crucified to people. I've never asked for a penny. I don't ask for a penny. I do this because my belief is everybody should see this. And everybody should know about this, what I know about it. Because it's changed my life. And I want it to change other people's lives. So that's why I'm here tonight, is to bring to you Jesus crucified and to bring you closer. Because what does he want? Souls. He wants souls. He thirsts for souls. So we need to bring him as many souls as we can, because this is what he's asked. And if this is what does it, then glory be to God. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Yes, sir.
Replicas were made of the shroud for exhibition purposes anyway?
So this is one. There have been quite a few that are made. I'm sure probably if you did like a Google search, you'd probably find a whole bunch of replicas. I know other people that do presentations, not personally, but I've seen on the internet, and they also have replicas of the shroud, so I'm sure that they're out there. Again, God works in funny ways, right? Last year, I did my presentation at St. Andrew's, my parish in Silver Spring. And there was a lady that came in, and I've seen her before, and she says to me, she said, I can't stay for the talk, but I'm going to come back. So I thought, okay, sure. So she comes back after the presentation, and she says to me, she said, I have something for you. She said, I used to do presentations. She said, but I have a hard time getting around now. She said, I'm a lot older. I can't do it alone. She said, would you come to my house and pick it up? So I thought, okay. So my wife and I went. So when we got there, she gifted me with this. So this is the first year that I've used it. God wanted me to have it. And just by happenstance, this lady says, I have a full-length shroud. Would you like to have it? And I said, absolutely. So again, God is working in some way that I don't know and I don't understand. But yes, you're right. I need to get my website, my book, and my video. He's especially working here tonight. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Have you been making presentations and, starting out collecting these artifacts?
So the only thing that I have collected is the nail. Everything else I made. I've made everything that you see on the table. Last year at St. John Newman, I presented with Alan. And we had to talk about, there was a slide that had the sudarium. So Alan, I think it was the night before we were supposed to go, Alan says to me, can you do a sudarium? So I was like, okay, let me see. Lord, I'm going to need some help. So I got an old sheet. I went outside. I ran it through the dirt. I took red food coloring, brown shoe polish, and tea. And I stained it to look like the sudarium. So that's my replica of the sudarium. But all this stuff, yeah, I made everything here with the exception of the thorn from Brother Joe and the nail. Online. I got the nail. He asked, where did I get the nail? I got the nail online from a site where they do replica crucifixions. I made everything, yeah. I sat one night and I took skewers and I cut them in half and I painted them white and I hand glued all of them on to the branches for the crown of thorns. It took me about an hour. It was tedious work, but I thought, you know what? I want people to see what the crown of thorns would have looked like. And since you can't buy these and I can't go to Jerusalem to cut the branches, I thought, you know what? I'm going to make them. So yeah, everything that you see here is handmade, and it's just my humble way of bringing Jesus to everybody. Yes, ma'am.
As someone who sees this, I don't know how many times I've been struck by pins. How many times did you get struck with her?
More than I can remember. More than I want to remember. And actually, I have gotten a few splinters demonstrating the patibulum carry. So I think that was God's way of saying, okay, you want to carry the cross, I'm going to help you. Right? He likes to do that to us sometimes. I see a hand. Yes, ma'am.
When did you start doing presentations and how many have you given? And how many churches have you gone to?
So I started 2 years ago with Alan, and I did my home parish. I did reach out to quite a few parishes, and I did have a couple of parishes that said they couldn't do anything this year, so we will be set hopefully for next year. But I'm open to parishes. It's not like it has to be done in March. This is not my full-time job, so this is just something that I do, as a way of bringing Christ to people. But I have no problems with traveling anywhere. If anybody here has a home parish and you'd like to have me present, please reach out to the pastor. I mean, we're not opposed to it at all. Not at all. I see another hand. Was there another question? Yes, ma'am. How long did it take me to make all of those? 45 years. No, I'm just kidding. No, it took me, her question was, and she asked another great question, how long did it take me to make all of this stuff? And my answer was 45 years. It took me, this took me about 2 weeks to do. These took me about a week to do. So I would say, and the thorns, that took me about an hour and a half to do one night. So I would say everything probably took about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks to do, because we also have 2 little boys. We have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. So in between that, it was very difficult. As much as I tried to lock myself in the room to do things, Daddy, where are you? Daddy, come out. So, if I could have worked straight, I probably could have done everything in about a week. So it took about 2 to 3 weeks. But a really good question. You keep asking great questions. I love it. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Have any non-Catholic churches invited you?
No. No. Her question was, has any non-Catholic churches invited us for presentations? And my answer was no.
The other answer, because you all are very blessed to give me top finish, and I just want to add that. And ma'am, to your question, my dad mainly spoke to the non-Catholic churches in the Bible. They were the ones who were very interested and this would be, he started in 1957 all the way through the 90s. And so it's not just a Catholic presentation. We found growing up, it was kind of more of a Protestant at that time. And when I was growing up, that it was the non-Catholic churches that really responded to this. Until the gentleman asked a very good question on Mark 14:8 and stopped.
That's true.
It seemed like a Catholic church came out. It was fascinating. But that's my own observation and kind of under the cover.
But there would be no opposition to going to a non-Catholic church and giving a presentation. It's just we haven't been exclusively invited, but if we were, we would definitely go. Yeah, 100% we would go.
I think this would be a wonderful presentation for Catholic high schools.
Yes, and I think that would be a great thing. And you know what? I was also thinking of, and I know it's very late in the season now, but I was thinking of reaching out to like Catholic University. I was also thinking of reaching out to the Dominican House in DC and the Capuchin College in DC. Last year, I did reach out to, I forget what they're, the Order of the Divine Mercy. The Marian Order, I think, Marian. There's one in Washington, D.C. by the Shrine. And I had reached out to them, and the priests were very interested. As a matter of fact, they were going to join us last year, Alan and I at St. John Newman, but they couldn't get away. They couldn't get permission to come. But the pastor that I had talked to used to give talks on the Shroud and had been in the Holy Land. So it would have been a great night if he had have been able to show up, but because of their duties, they weren't able to make it. But I mean, that is on my list to reach out to these places. I think it would be great for them to hear it also. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Come up and take pictures.